Hello, Brain Damage Philosopher here, and in this video I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the possible existence or non-existence of common ground between those with a Christian worldview and those with an atheist worldview. Before I get to that, however, I want to make a supplemental point about the argument from contingency, which I covered in the previous video about Peter Kreeft's apologetic arguments that I forgot to make in that video because I was rushing, and it's by far the longest video I've ever made. So the point I wanted to make about the argument from contingency is that in the video that I originally said that it's possible for every particular thing to be contingent, but the fact that things exist to be necessary, which I still believe is probably the right answer, since religious people have religious people are appealing to a necessarily existent thing anyway, so why not just make existence itself necessary? But to the other point that I could have made that I want to make here is that one of the things that the argument does is say that if something could exist or not exist, right? If non-existence is a logical possibility for something, thereby making it meet the definition of contingent that the argument is using, then given an infinite amount of time, even if that thing randomly existed for a while, it would have gone into non-existence at some point. If it were possible for it to not exist. But I'm not sure that's the case, because if we're going to say that something needs a reason for existing or not existing, if we're going to say that something needs a reason for existing, then I would say that we would also say something needs a reason for going out of existence as well. So if something happened to exist, given an infinite amount of time, why would it not just continue to exist, right? And if we are okay with things popping into and out of existence for no particular reason except that it is logically possible, then once something has popped, a contingent thing has popped out of existence, why couldn't it pop into existence again? And we just happen to exist in a cycle when a bunch of contingent things happen to be in existence, and they'll all go out of existence at some point, and then and there will be nothing for a while, and then something else will contingently pop into existence, right? I think the fundamental flaw with saying that if there's an infinite amount of time, all logical possibilities will become actualities at some point, is that I don't really see that there's a reason for that to be true. Because logical possibilities are different than statistical possibilities or probabilities. Statistical probabilities are things that can happen based on the other things that exist, and that perhaps have some established prior, whereas logical possibilities are things that are merely conceivable, but may have no relation to the actual state of things existing. So if something happened to exist for some unknown reason, I see no reason to assume that all logically possible things would happen to it given enough time. Furthermore, again, as far as we can tell, time is not infinite in the past. And so if the singularity just in the actual world happens to exist, right, and we don't really know why, why would we think that if it happened to exist, right, and started time, and we're living in the aftermath and expansion of that, why would we think that it would pop out of existence? It would there hasn't been infinite time for all of the logically possible things to happen to it yet, right? And we do think that the universe will, in some sense, go out of existence eventually, with the cold death of the universe, when entropy sort of maxes out. So, I don't know. It's a very strange argument, and it's kind of confusing, and I think that's why it seems to work, like most apologetic arguments. But moving on to the main point that I wanted to cover in this video. So one of the things that you'll see presuppositional apologists say often is that there is no common ground between a Christian and an atheist. And so for a Christian to attempt to demonstrate the existence of a God to an atheist on the basis of, without first assuming a God, is to step onto the atheist's ground, not to step onto common ground. And there is a slight kernel of truth to this, in the sense that if the atheist is merely someone that does not believe in the existence of a God, then to leave aside your belief in God in order to convince the atheist is to become an atheist, sort of hypothetically for a little bit, in order to show the atheist how you go from their position to your position. However, that's how all argumentation works. An argument, when you're trying to convince someone, is to show them how you can go from their position, their set of facts and assumptions, to your set of facts and to your belief about the nature of those facts and assumptions. You can introduce new facts to them, right? But you can't directly introducing them to the conclusion is merely to skip out on an argument. The entire point of an argument is to show the person how you can go from their position to yours. So while the presuppositional apologist is trivially right in the sense that to convince someone who is not convinced of a proposition that you believe in, you have to sort of, for the sake of argument, take their position and then show them how to get from their position to yours. That doesn't mean that you are necessarily placing yourself on weaker ground. Otherwise, it would be impossible to win any argument, even about matters of fact and evidence. Right? And the reason, I think, that... But the reason that presuppositionalists bring this up, I think, is that once they step onto the atheist's ground, they find it extremely difficult, if not impossible, to go from the atheist's ground to the ground that they truly hold and which they started in. And so this gives them the sense that they've given up more by attempting to convince an atheist based on grounds that do not already assume the theistic conclusion than you give up in a normal argument. But they only have that sense merely because there are no good arguments and no good evidence to support transitioning from the atheist's perspective to the theist's perspective, and that's a contingent accident about the actual world, not a necessary component of the nature of theistic and atheistic beliefs, which is what the presuppositionalist is trying to propose. In essence, what's happening here is that whenever you make an argument, you give up ground to a certain degree, hypothetically, right, and because if you give up any ground in the case of a theistic argument, right, in essence, if you don't already begin with the assumption of God, then it's impossible to regain that ground simply because of an accident of, what evidence we have available to us. This confuses apologists into thinking that it isn't, because of how difficult it is not in fact an accident of what evidence we have available to us, but part of the nature of worldviews themselves. But we can demonstrate that this is untrue by a simple thought experiment, which is best elaborated on in the Ted Chiang short story, Hell is the Absence of God, where miracles and demonstrations of the existence of God and heaven and hell and angels and so on are such a regular feature of the lives of everybody in that short story that no one can reasonably deny that a God exists and at least some of the properties and beliefs and actions of that God. And we could, conceivably live in a universe like that, in which case, a theist trying to convince an atheist could hypothetically and temporarily quote unquote, step onto the atheist's ground and then show the atheist how, from their own position, they have to transition to theistic ground, just as you can do when making any other kind of argument. So, in essence, the core problem with saying that there is no common ground between an atheist and a theist is that it's confusing a contingent reality about our actual world, the fact that there is no good evidence for a God, with a necessary property of atheist and theist beliefs. And this is further compounded by the fact that most apologists that propose this view have no clear understanding of the kind of naturalism that most atheists affirm. You see, the vast majority of atheists today are what would be called agnostic or weak atheists, because it is basically impossible to hold in an intellectually honest manner the strong or gnostic atheist position. And part of being an agnostic or weak atheist is saying that, taking at least as a basic presupposition, or as a basic assumption for whatever reasons that someone might have to make it such an assumption, that the best way to learn about reality is through the means by which the only means by which we interact with reality and experience it, and so through the only means by which it even matters to us in the first place, which is our senses. And so, whenever we try to find the best explanation to explain the evidence that comes to us through our senses, right? And what theists think is that the atheists begin from an assumption that there is no such thing as a supernatural and that gods cannot exist. And of course, if they did in fact begin with that assumption, then it would be impossible to convert an atheist into a theist. However, by argument at least. By adopting, and there would be no common ground between an atheist and a theist. But that's not what they're assuming. They're just they're starting with wanting to know about reality through the only means by which we have to interact with reality, and that reality seems to not require and even discourage a God belief. And if that could be shown to be false, then an atheist would switch over to believing in a God. They don't assume, and further, likewise, they don't assume that the supernatural does not exist. It's merely that supernatural occurrences have not been demonstrated to exist. If we could reliably interact with, testably interact with, for instance, let's say, the ghosts of the dead. What is it called? A seance or something, reliably worked, and we could summon up the ghosts of our dead ancestors and talk to them, and they were able to tell us things that only they would have known, that they had told no one but, us, for instance, or things like that. Then a good atheist would, accept that as a part of reality. They would not assume that, that can't be true because, naturalism is by necessity true, right? And this is the difference between methodological and metaphysical naturalism. Methodological naturalism says there's two categories of ways of explaining things: the supernatural way of explaining things and the natural way of explaining things. So far, every time we've tried to explain something using supernatural, it's turned out later to be natural. And, so far, we've only really demonstrated that natural things exist. So, we're going to set out trying first to find a natural explanation to something. And if we can't find a natural explanation, unless we can demonstrate positively, as in, have evidence for it being supernatural, we won't assume it's supernatural. So basically, the difference between a methodological naturalist and a religious person is that for a methodological naturalist, we have no evidence that the category of supernatural things exists. And so if we can't find a natural explanation, we're going to use the inductive prior that we'll eventually find a natural explanation, and we're going to say that let's not posit a supernatural explanation just yet. But if there was evidence for a supernatural explanation, not merely an absence of evidence for a particular natural explanation, because an absence of evidence for a particular natural explanation is not an absence of evidence that there is a natural explanation at all. A methodological naturalist would obviously then accept that the supernatural was a good explanation for this thing. Meanwhile, what a religious person does is say, well, if I can't come up with a whole just so story about how this exact thing happened, or even if I can, if that naturalistic explanation seems kind of unlikely to me, I can just jump straight to a supernatural explanation, which the core problem with that being, besides the fact that the absence of the evidence, and all that, the core problem with that, besides the fact that the absence of a particular natural explanation is not evidence that it must be a supernatural explanation, and besides the fact that we have all of this inductive evidence for the fact that the explanation will turn out to be natural, the other problem is that the supernatural itself, as a category of things that have not been demonstrated, is necessarily more unlikely than even the most unlikely natural explanation. Because when you have a natural explanation, what we mean by that is an explanation that relies on occurrences that we know to be possible based on other similar occurrences that we've already seen. Because we define natural based on the category of things that regularly happen or that can demonstrably happen, right? And this is the other thing, is that the supernatural seems like a strange word to me, because if something were a regular feature of our existence and was well attested and is something that happened, if something either happened regularly and was an established category of things that could happen, or happened only a few times but was well attested, we would simply call it natural. We wouldn't call it supernatural, because it would be a well understood and accepted component of our existence. So the whole idea that you can explain things by supernatural is basically saying that you're explaining things by appealing to things that we've never seen before and have no reason to think could happen. And so my point by saying all of this is that the difference between a theist and an atheist when it comes to explaining things is not the assumption that the supernatural is impossible on the one hand and that the supernatural is possible on the other, but simply that an atheist is trying to arrive at the best explanation for the sense experiences that he has, and the experiences of others, and it will not attempt to conclude an explanation until there's sufficient evidence positively indicating a particular explanation, and unless that explanation makes predictions and is falsifiable and verifiable. Meanwhile, a theist begins with the assumption that the supernatural is possible, and also begins with the assumption that the supernatural is active and exists, and then interprets everything in that light. In essence, actually, the problem of common ground between atheists and theists is necessarily the reverse of how a presuppositional apologist sees it. To a presuppositional apologist, a theist is looking clearly at the world and accepting whatever they see, where an atheist is assuming that the supernatural and that the supernatural and God do not exist. Meanwhile, the reverse is actually true. An atheist is attempting to explain the world based on what they're capable of seeing in the world, whereas a theist is beginning with certain assumptions and trying to interpret everything in light of that. Now, of course, the presuppositional apologist would be right to point out that both the theist and the atheist have starting presuppositions. the starting presupposition of the theist is, as I said, that God and the supernatural exist and are active in their lives. Whereas the starting presupposition of the atheist is that an external world exists and that their senses are, at least, prima facie, when we have nothing else to rely upon, the best way we have to try to interact with that external world. However, so this raises the question, well, whose presupposition... So this is the other thing, is that from their basic presuppositions, theists also arrive at the conclusion that there is an external world and that their senses are a good way of arriving at conclusions about that external world. To a certain degree. There are many passages in the Bible that say that, faith is more to be rewarded than relying on evidence and so on. But, most Christians conveniently ignore that passage or forget about it when debating atheists. So we can leave that aside for the moment. Most theists still rely on evidence to learn about the world and believe that there is an external world, which means that they do actually have a common set of beliefs with atheists. It's just that for atheists, those beliefs are presuppositions, and for theists, those beliefs may not be. But the origin of those beliefs does not matter when you're trying to find common ground, because common ground just means common beliefs. If you have common beliefs, no matter where those beliefs came from, you can leverage them to come to agreed upon conclusions. This is why if I ask someone if they agree that stealing is wrong, and they do, and I also agree that stealing is wrong, we have common ground even if we disagree about why stealing is wrong, and then I can make arguments to them about, for instance, the nature of the state and government and so on the basis of our common ground that stealing is wrong. And it may turn out that their belief that stealing is wrong has different nuances than mine does. But that's not necessarily the case, and no matter how they arrived at whether stealing was wrong or not, if they do believe it the same way that I do, it's still common ground. So it's still possible to find common ground between theists and atheists. Additionally, I would like to point out that I said that the presuppositions that theists hold are that God and the supernatural exist and are active and interact with them, right? Those are not the only presuppositions that they have, however. This is an interesting nuance that I didn't cover in my video on the transcendental arguments, because I'm still sort of mulling it over, and I think that Christians who say that they only presuppose special revelation from God, I think they have a bit of a problem in that when they say that, they say that they're not taking that as... Okay, so this is a little bit difficult to explain, and this may not be a good objection. Okay, so I want to do a little sidebar here, and I will get back to what I was just saying, but I guess, okay, so before I do the sidebar and get off on this tangent, I want to wrap up the common ground thing by saying that basically what the presuppositional apologist is admitting when they say that there can be no common ground between theists and atheists is that you cannot arrive at the conclusion that God exists in reality apart from our own mind unless you assume that that is true to begin with. Which would be fine if the existence of God were a proposition that would be in principle unverifiable, unfalsifiable, and undemonstrable. However, that is not the case. And this is the core problem that they have, is that any person who believes a proposition that is merely contingently in our actual world undemonstrable can say the same thing. If I believe that, I have, an invisible friend, right? And I don't like using this example because it sounds demeaning towards religious people. And I wish I could come up with something like cooler that a religious person could be like excited about me comparing them to. I guess like maybe, like some kind of, you know, I don't know. I'm just not feeling particularly creative right now. So, Theists, sorry if this sounds demeaning. I wanted to think of something like cool, like some kind of, let's say I have uh, like this powerful spirit that's sort of like some kind of spirit animal thing, that works sort of like a guardian angel, right? And I can use it to do magical things or whatever, right? Um, let's say I believe that proposition. So it's some kind of like, I think like a stand from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, although I haven't watched that show. Um, if I believe the proposition that I had, such an invisible magical entity guarding me, right? Um, that is in principle demonstrable. And so if there were evidence for it, then I would have no need of saying that the only way to get to believing that proposition is to assume it to begin with, because I could take someone who didn't believe in that proposition, but did agree with me that evidence is a good way of doing epistemology. I could take them and show them the evidence, and then they would agree, right? But if it was somehow not demonstrable in any way, and not like that I had such a spirit, because I believe that, for instance, the spirit only acted in ways that seemed natural, or only did magical things when no one else was in the room, and the magical things never left a trace, or something like that. Um, or I believe that the magical spirit existed and followed me around, but just has never happened to do anything verifiably supernatural, in a way that like could have evidence for it. I would be right in saying that the only way to end up believing in the proposition that such a spirit existed would be to assume it to begin with, because there would be no evidence to or arguments that could transition someone from not believing to believing. But that doesn't mean that there is no common ground between me, who believes this proposition, and others who don't. Or that we are on equal footing, because I'm just making an assumption and they're just making an assumption. I'm making an assumption that could be verified, but isn't verifiable because doesn't have evidence for it. Whereas they're making much more basic assumptions about evidence and senses in the world and so on. Okay, yeah. So back to the sidebar that I wanted to make earlier. One of the things that I've sort of learned is over time with arguing with philosophy, about philosophy with people, and not just on the about theist versus atheist stuff, but also just about general philosophical positions, is that I need to sometimes listen to my intuition about an argument, because oftentimes arguments can rely on things that are really hard to notice, but are wrong. Because the thing about an argument is that the person who's proposing the argument, usually thinks the argument is correct. And the reason that they think the argument is correct is because they've combed over it themselves, removing all of the flaws that they could see, right? So they essentially push the argument, even if the argument isn't correct, if you keep trying to revise an argument to improve it and make it correct, you're just, keep trying to find arguments for a proposition that you're sure is correct. You don't know if you're revising an argument to be correct, or just revising an argument to be wrong in a way that you yourself can't tell. Or you don't know that you're selecting an argument that is correct for the proposition that you're holding on to, or that you've merely found an argument that you can't find the problem with. And this is a universal problem for all philosophers. But what this means is that oftentimes when someone, when someone who's spent a lot of time arguing about a subject proposes an argument to me, and I have an intuitive feeling that something is wrong with the argument in a certain area, then that might be an indication that this argument isn't correct. It's just out of their reach, just out of their reach, and maybe, just within my reach, or maybe it's just within their reach too, because I'm not like that much smarter than them, but they are just ignoring the nagging intuitive feeling, or they've managed to just, smush it, right? Because you can sometimes do that, if it's vague enough. And so I've learned not to completely trust my intuition. Like, I don't just say an argument is wrong because intuitively it seems wrong to me, but it usually leads me to try to do some introspection and some thought about their argument to try to see where that intuition is coming from. And sometimes the intuition comes from something that isn't actually wrong with the argument. It's just that my intuition is wrong, and then I try to retrain my intuition. But sometimes it's my intuition, which I've spent a lot of time training, is actually pointing to something that is a real problem with the argument. And so while I've already dealt, I think, perfectly satisfactorily with the presuppositional arguments in my previous video, there's still a nagging intuitive problem that I have with specifically Sye-Ten-Bruggenkate's presuppositionalist argument, which is more similar to like Gordon H. Clark's version and Greg Bahnsen's version and so on than Matt Slick's is. And I'm going to try to explain intuitively what I think the problem that I'm not able to quite grasp is with that argument, and maybe eventually I'll come out with another video making it more concrete. But here it is. So when an apologist is saying that they are taking as a presupposition that the special revelation that they get from God is true, or like the feelings that they get, they're taking it as a presupposition that those feelings that they get are actually a special revelation from God, and are therefore true. I think the problem is that they not only have to take, they also have to take for granted that their reasoning and interpretation of what those feelings are indicating and mean, they have to assume that that is true. So they have to presuppose their own mind and reasoning. But if they're presupposing their own reasoning, in order to base it on the special revelation, then they are in a then I can, why should I not be able to presuppose my own reasoning, and then through my reasoning come to different conclusions about what I should presuppose and so on. Furthermore, and this is a little bit more concrete, another problem is that while I, as an atheist who believes that there are such things as performatively basic beliefs, don't actually have to assume my reasoning to justify my reasoning, I'm just assuming, I'm not assuming my reasoning and then using that to justify my reasoning, and assuming my senses and using that to justify my senses. I'm just assuming my reasoning and senses, and I have a meta justification for why those assumptions are good presuppositions, but I don't use them to try to argue on the same level to come up with a reason why they are true, just why I should assume them, or why it's useful to assume them, or why it's necessary to assume them. And this is different from what a presuppositionalist is doing, because what a presuppositionalist is doing is saying that you should assume that you're getting special revelation from God because otherwise, I guess that's not quite right. So I and the presuppositionalists are basically doing the same thing. I'm saying I need to assume laws of logic and stuff like that in my own existence. Otherwise, because I can't help it, basically. And so if there's something that I can't help but assume, I might as well just document the fact that I'm stuck assuming that and then see what I can get out of that, since I'm stuck with it. Whereas a presuppositionalist is trying to say you should assume this because otherwise you're reduced to absurdity, which is different. Because I'm talking about what we necessarily already assume, what we're stuck with, and what we can get out of that, where they're talking about something that you're not stuck with because you don't necessarily have to assume revelation from God, but that they think that you should assume it anyway, which puts them on a weaker position, because if we can assume things, why not assume things that are already that are more basic, that we're already stuck with anyway, and then try to build off that. And a presuppositionalist might say, well, you're assuming things that don't have a justification for them, whereas I'm assuming something that provides a justification for the things that you're assuming. But the problem with that is that they're getting that justification from the things that they're trying to justify, even if they have something else in the mix. They're using their reasoning and senses to justify, to get from the assumption of special revelation to reasoning and senses, and so they're still begging the question, even if they've added in another premise that isn't related to the conclusion. Whereas I'm not doing any such thing. This also goes back to the problem where, they're not only telling us to assume something that's not obvious and not necessary, it's also something that could be substantiated, it just hasn't been. But yeah. So this has been kind of a strange multi-subject rambling video, so I guess, sorry about that, but, there you go. It is what it is. Bye.